In the isolated corners of Yazoo County, a story remained hidden for decades, a swampy region where family secrets are guarded with the same tenacity used to protect properties from river floods. Revealed as the most impure wife ever in Mississippi lands, Mary had 6 children with her own cousin. Young Mary Elizabeth Olay, born in 1905, grew up in a small farming community where everyone somehow shared blood ties. This was in 1923, when Mississippi was still struggling to recover from the post-war economic impacts and rural communities became increasingly isolated. 3 generations earlier, the Olay family had settled in that swampy Mississippi region. This was after Patriarch William Olay received land from the government following the Civil War. Among his descendants, who rarely ventured beyond the community's boundaries, the property was divided over the years. This isolation wasn't merely geographical, but also social and cultural. Daughter of George Olay, a stern man who firmly managed his portion of land, Mary grew up in a simple wooden house. Her mother, Eliza Olay, a second cousin to her father, died when Mary was only 9, a victim of a fever that none of the home remedies could cure. Mary early assumed domestic responsibilities without her mother's presence, caring for her 3 younger siblings and helping with household chores. Her cousin, Robert Olay, 7 years her senior, was her only comfort in her restricted life. Considered a promising young man in the community, Robert was the son of Mary's paternal uncle, James Olay. Unlike other youths, he had spent 2 years studying in Jackson, the state capital, before returning to help the family with cotton plantations. He brought stories of a world Mary could only imagine. Initially supervised during family gatherings, the meetings between the cousins gradually became more frequent and private. Robert taught Mary to read and write, sharing with her the few books he had brought from the city. For a young woman whose formal education had been interrupted at 10, those lessons represented a rare window to the outside world. When Mary turned 16 in 1921, her father announced she would marry Robert, then 23. The arrangement, although common in that isolated community, caused no surprise. An established practice justified by the need to keep lands within the family, unions between relatives were seen as a way to preserve what they called the purity of Olay blood. The wedding was celebrated in a simple ceremony at the small local church, attended by families from both sides, which in fact were the same family. No objection was made by the pastor, accustomed to such unions, to the marriage between cousins. After all, in the biblical interpretation of that isolated community, such bonds were considered not only acceptable but desirable. A house built on the property adjacent to their parents' lands is where Mary and Robert settled. The young couple took responsibility for cultivating that portion of land while planning to expand the family. The expectation was that they would have many children to help with rural work and perpetuate the family name, as tradition dictated. It wasn't long before Mary became pregnant. In 1922, her first child, William, was born, named after the family patriarch. The delivery was difficult. Performed at home with assistance from a local midwife, the baby, although small for gestational age, showed no characteristics that might alarm the parents or community. Peculiarities began to manifest during William's first year. The baby didn't react normally to sound stimuli, remained unusually quiet, and his motor development was significantly delayed compared to other children of the same age. The community's explanation was simple: each child has its own pace. Make sure you're already subscribed to this channel. Truths that authorities try to erase from official records will be revealed by stories like Mary's. Subscribe now to discover the darkest secrets of American families that conventional history dares not tell. A girl christened Elizabeth in honor of her paternal grandmother was Mary's second child, born in 1924. Unlike William, Elizabeth seemed to develop normally in the first months. However, as she grew, a distinctive physical characteristic became evident. Abnormally close together, her eyes gave her an appearance that caused discomfort even among family members. Attributing such characteristics to family marks, the community was already accustomed to seeing certain physical peculiarities among its members. Nobody openly questioned the possibility that such traits resulted from successive consanguineous unions that had characterized the Olay lineage for generations. In 1926, the third child, George Jr., was born. From birth, the boy presented respiratory difficulties and, unlike his siblings, showed notably stunted physical growth. His cry was weak, almost inaudible, and Mary spent sleepless nights, fearing the baby wouldn't survive until morning. Miraculously, George Jr. survived his first year, although he remained fragile and susceptible to frequent pulmonary infections. Initially expressing pride in his wife's fertility and the continuity of the family lineage, Robert began showing concern about his children's health. In private conversations with Mary, he expressed doubts about continuing to expand the family considering the difficulties faced by their existing children. However, social pressure from the community and mainly from family patriarchs impelled the couple to continue producing descendants. Olai blood must prosper, was the mantra repeated by Robert's father during Sunday family gatherings. Mary became pregnant again in 1928. This pregnancy, unlike previous ones, was marked by complications from the beginning. Severe nausea, abnormal swelling, and persistent pain caused the young mother, then 23, to appear much older. When in the 7th month she went into premature labor, the local midwife declared herself unable to handle the situation. For the first time, an outside doctor was called to attend a Olai family member. Dr. James Blackwood, newly established in neighboring Yazoo City, faced initial family resistance when examining Mary. The diagnosis was serious: the placenta had partially detached, risking both mother and baby's lives. An emergency cesarean section was performed in the Olai home with hastily sterilized instruments and improvised lamplight. The procedure, considered extremely risky under available conditions, resulted in the birth of twins, a boy and a girl, both premature with alarmingly low weight. Baptized Joseph and Judith, the twins spent their first weeks fighting for survival. A congenital heart malformation identified by Dr. Blackwood as a murmur that would likely accompany him throughout life was what Joseph had. Judith was born with a pronounced cleft palate that complicated her feeding and made her susceptible to frequent infections. Dr. Blackwood observed the other family children during Mary's recovery. In his personal diary, later discovered after his death in 1961, the doctor recorded his impressions about the Olai couple's children. I observe in the children physical and behavioral characteristics suggesting deleterious effects of consanguineous crossing. William, now 6, demonstrates significant hearing impairment and evident cognitive delay. Elizabeth, 4, presents hypertelorism and erratic behavior. George Jr., 2, exhibits proportionate dwarfism and compromised pulmonary function. Trained at Tulane University in New Orleans and familiar with genetic advances beginning to gain attention in scientific circles, the doctor tried discreetly to address with Robert the risks associated with consanguineous marriages. However, his educational attempts were met with hostility and distrust. The family patriarch, upon learning of these conversations, strictly forbade the doctor's return to the property. "Our blood is strong," declared the patriarch during a family meeting. "We have lived this way for generations and prospered. We don't need modern ideas from this city doctor." Despite the official prohibition of Dr. Blackwood's return, Robert, secretly concerned about his family's health, continued meeting him occasionally in town. During these clandestine encounters, the doctor provided basic medications and guidance for treating the children, especially the twins, whose survival remained uncertain. During one of these visits, Dr. Blackwood gave Robert a recently published scientific article on genetic risks of consanguineous marriages. The document, written in academic language and illustrated with complex diagrams, remained hidden under the house floorboards, consulted by Robert on rare occasions when he found himself alone. The dynamics between Mary and Robert began to change during this period. What was previously a relationship based on obedience and tradition gradually transformed into a partnership marked by shared concern for their children's welfare. Despite her limited education, Mary demonstrated keen intuition regarding each child's specific needs, developing her own techniques to stimulate William's development and facilitate Judith's feeding. Meanwhile, in the broader Yazoo County community, rumors about the strange Olai family began circulating. The local school teacher, who had unsuccessfully tried to integrate William into classes, commented on the boy's difficulties. The town merchant, who occasionally saw Robert with the twins during doctor visits, spread stories about the deformed children of the Olice. Feeling increasingly isolated and stigmatized, the family reinforced their seclusion. Visits to town became less frequent, and participation in community events, such as Sunday worship, was gradually abandoned. The Holloway property, surrounded by swamps and accessible only by a dirt road often impassable during the rainy season, transformed into an island of isolation in the already isolated Yazoo County. The family's economic situation deteriorated significantly in 1930 when the Great Depression was already ravaging the United States. Cotton prices plummeted and the family's financial reserve, already limited, rapidly depleted. Food and medicine scarcity became daily realities, especially affecting the most vulnerable children. In this context of deprivation, Mary became pregnant for the 5th time. The news, received with apprehension by Robert and resignation by Mary, was celebrated by the extended family as a sign that the Holloways would continue prospering despite hard times. The pregnancy, accompanied by Mary's progressive health deterioration, culminated in the birth of the 6th child in April 1931. The girl, named Sarah, was born with a visibly smaller than normal head and, in the midwife's words, with a look that didn't seem of this world. Microcephaly was the term Dr. Blackwood, secretly called by Robert, used to describe Sarah's condition. Now more experienced and firmly convinced of consanguinity risks, the doctor made a last desperate appeal to Robert. "Mr. Oli, this is the direct result of unions between close relatives in your family. Modern science has established beyond doubt that such practices dramatically increase the risk of birth defects. Please don't allow your wife to face another pregnancy. The next could cost her life." Shaken by his newborn daughter's condition and Mary's debilitated state, Robert promised the doctor there would be no more children. This promise, kept secret from his extended family, marked the beginning of a silent break with Holloway traditions. Mary's health, already compromised by successive pregnancies and inadequate nutrition, deteriorated further during the months following Sarah's birth. She developed severe anemia, diagnosed by Dr. Blackwood as resulting from the combination of frequent births, a deficient diet, and possibly genetic factors related to consanguinity. The treatment, limited by available resources and family isolation, consisted mainly of a diet enriched with liver and dark leafy greens, cultivated in the small garden that Mary, even weakened, insisted on maintaining. Contrary to the family tradition of exclusively trusting home remedies, Robert secretly obtained iron supplements prescribed by Dr. Blackwood. While Mary struggled for recovery, the responsibility of caring for the 6 children fell increasingly on Elizabeth, then only 6 years old. The girl, despite her own limitations, demonstrated precocious maturity and remarkable dedication to her siblings. The firstborn, William, now 9, remained severely limited in his cognitive abilities, but had developed surprising skill for repetitive manual work, becoming Robert's constant helper in plantation work. An incident that would profoundly mark the family occurred during this particularly difficult period. Joseph, one of the twins, then 3 years old, disappeared one afternoon while playing in the yard. The desperate search mobilized all extended family members who scoured the property and surrounding swamps for hours. The boy's body was found at dusk, floating in a small lake not far from the house. The tragedy, attributed to a lack of adequate supervision by more critical relatives, intensified the guilt already consuming Mary and Robert. Held in the small family cemetery, Joseph's funeral was marked by oppressive silence and the absence of spiritual consolation. The local pastor, who had for years discreetly expressed reservations about the family's matrimonial practices, offered only formal words of condolence without the usual promise of reunion in paradise. If you're following this story and feel that knot in your throat, imagining these children's silent suffering, leave in the comments. May the silenced voices of the Olice never be forgotten. Your comment keeps alive the memory of those society preferred to ignore. The family's isolation intensified further after Joseph's death. Robert, consumed by remorse and a growing awareness of consanguinity's effects on his family, began drinking excessively. Homemade whiskey, clandestinely distilled during Prohibition, became his refuge from daily painful realities. Mary, in turn, found consolation in religion, although in an intensely personal way distant from local church dogmas. She spent hours reading the worn Bible that had belonged to her mother, focusing especially on Psalms of Lamentation and stories of redemption. In her personal diary, discovered decades later, she wrote, "God gave us these trials for a reason I don't understand. I accept His will, but I pray that my children suffer no more than they already have." A new threat came to the Olai family in the year 1932. Social workers, part of a newly implemented federal program to assist rural families during the Depression, tried to visit the property after receiving reports from Dr. Blackwood about the children's situation. Fearing the children might be removed from home, Robert refused to allow government officials entry, threatening them with a shotgun. This incident, reported to local authorities, resulted in a court order for property inspection. However, the county sheriff, a distant cousin of the Holloway family and sympathetic to their cause, deliberately delayed executing the order, giving the family time to prepare. Mary and Robert worked tirelessly during the weeks preceding the official inspection to improve the property's appearance. The house was cleaned and repaired. Children were instructed on behavior, and William, whose limitations were most evident, was temporarily sent to stay with relatives on a distant property. When social workers finally conducted the inspection in September 1932, they found a situation that, while far from ideal, didn't justify the immediate intervention Dr. Blackwood had requested. The official report, preserved in county archives, described the family as impoverished but adequately cared for considering prevailing economic circumstances. Dr. Blackwood, frustrated with what he considered a serious system failure, wrote in his diary, "The Holloway tragedy continues to unfold with local authorities' connivance. The children, innocent victims of outdated and harmful matrimonial practices, remain trapped in a suffering cycle that could be interrupted with proper intervention." Life on the Hollow property followed its isolated course during subsequent years. The children grew, each facing specific challenges. Elizabeth developed remarkable sewing ability, creating clothes from flour sacks and discarded fabrics. Despite his fragile constitution, George Jr. proved a dedicated student, learning to read and write with the help of the few books available in the house. Judith, the surviving twin, underwent rude surgery to partially correct her cleft palate in 1934 when an itinerant surgeon visited Yazoo City. The operation, performed with minimal anesthesia and in conditions far below acceptable medical standards, improved her feeding and speech ability, although it left visible scars. The youngest, Sarah, presented the most severe condition. Her microcephaly was associated with significant neurological impairment, manifested by frequent seizures and extremely limited development. At 3, she still neither spoke nor walked, requiring constant care that fell mainly on Mary and Elizabeth. The family's economic situation slightly improved in 1935 with the implementation of New Deal programs in the region. The Agricultural Adjustment Administration, AAA, offered subsidies for farmers to reduce cotton production, stabilizing prices. With this financial aid, Robert managed to minimally diversify production, introducing vegetable cultivation and pig breeding for local sale. This relative stability allowed Mary, for the first time in years, to consider the possibility of providing some form of formal education for her children. With the exception of William, whose cognitive limitations were too severe, and Sarah, whose neurological impairment prevented any structured learning, the other 3 children began irregularly attending the local school in 1936. The integration of the Holloway children into the local school proved extremely challenging. Elizabeth, then 12, faced constant ridicule due to her unusual appearance. George Jr., despite his intelligence, was often isolated due to his fragile constitution and disease susceptibility. Judith, with her speech compromised by the partially corrected cleft palate, became a preferred target for childish cruelty. The teacher, Miss Eleanor Davis, a young idealist recently graduated and assigned to that remote rural school, tried without much success to protect the Holloway children from incessant bullying. In a letter to her former internship supervisor, preserved in the Jackson Normal School archive, she wrote, "The Holloway children exemplify the tragic consequences of cultural isolation and scientific ignorance that persist in our rural communities. Despite their evident challenges, they demonstrate remarkable resilience and in George's case especially, a genuine desire to learn that overcomes any physical limitation. A significant incident in the family's history occurred during this period. In December 1936, during a Christmas presentation at school, Judith was cast to recite a short poem. Her performance, marked by pronunciation difficulties but delivered with notable determination, was interrupted by laughter and malicious comments from some children, and more disturbingly from some parents present. Robert, who rarely attended public events, had made an exception to see his daughter. Faced with Judith's humiliation, he lost control, physically confronting one of the parents who had made a particularly cruel comment. The altercation quickly escalated, resulting in the permanent expulsion of the Olai children from school and a restraining order against Robert. This incident marked a turning point for the family. Robert, already tormented by guilt and increasingly dependent on alcohol, isolated himself completely. Mary, realizing formal education wouldn't be an option for her children, took responsibility for teaching them at home using the few available books and her own limited knowledge. Mary's health, which had relatively stabilized in previous years, began deteriorating again in 1938. At 33, she appeared much older with prematurely gray hair and a constitution weakened by years of exhausting work and successive pregnancies. She developed a persistent cough that, according to Dr. Blackwood, secretly consulted by Elizabeth, suggested tuberculosis. The diagnosis, kept secret from Robert, who would probably have prohibited any contact with the doctor, was shared only with Elizabeth, now 14 and effectively the family's primary caregiver. Aware of available treatment limitations and the probable refusal of hospitalization, Dr. Blackwood provided the young girl with detailed instructions on minimizing contagion and alleviating her mother's symptoms. During the following months, Elizabeth assumed extraordinary responsibility for someone her age. Besides caring for Sarah, whose condition required constant attention, and supervising other siblings, she now also needed to protect them from possible tuberculosis contagion from her mother without revealing the exact nature of the disease. Robert, increasingly emotionally absent and frequently intoxicated, barely perceived the situation's gravity. In his moments of sobriety, he worked mechanically on the plantation, now significantly reduced, and minimally interacted with the family. During periods of drunkenness, he alternated between deep melancholy and fits of rage, frequently directed against himself. It was during one such episode in April 1939 that another tragic event occurred. Robert, after a heated discussion with his father about property management, drank himself to unconsciousness. The next morning, he was found by William in one of the property sheds, having apparently ended his own life during the night. Robert's suicide, although suspected by the extended family, was officially recorded as accidental death due to intervention by the local sheriff, who wished to avoid the stigma associated with suicide and a possible refusal of religious burial. The funeral, conducted quickly and with minimal community participation, marked the lowest point in the Holloway's saga. Mary, already debilitated by tuberculosis and now widowed at 34, faced the new reality with a mixture of resignation and determination. In her diary, she wrote, "Perhaps it's a sin, but I feel as much relief as sadness with Robert's departure. He hasn't truly been with us for a long time. Now at least I no longer need to witness his self-destruction." The responsibility of supporting the family fell to William, then 17. Despite his cognitive limitations, the young man had developed a practical understanding of agriculture and, with occasional guidance from his grandfather, assumed basic administration of the property. Elizabeth, at 15, effectively became the family head in all other aspects, making decisions about siblings' education, house administration, and possible medical care. George Jr., now 13, compensated for his physical fragility with sharp, self-taught intelligence. He had practically exhausted the few books available in the house and occasionally obtained additional material through Dr. Blackwood, who continued secretly visiting the family. The doctor, impressed with the boy's insight, began nurturing hope that George might eventually escape the cycle of isolation and limitations characterizing the family. Judith, at 11, had developed a remarkable talent for music, playing by ear an ancient Celtic harp that had belonged to her maternal great-grandmother. Her musical ability dramatically contrasted with her speech difficulties, creating a dichotomy that Elizabeth would later describe as, "The voice God denied her in words, he granted her in music." The youngest, Sarah, at 8, remained severely impaired. She could now take some steps with support and communicate through simple gestures, but remained nonverbal and completely dependent on care. Seizures, although partially controlled by an herbal tincture developed by Mary based on traditional knowledge, still occurred with disturbing frequency. The winter of 1939 to 1940 was particularly severe in Mississippi, with unusually low temperatures and frequent rains that transformed dirt paths into impassable mud. The family's isolation, already pronounced under normal conditions, became almost absolute during these months. It was in this context of extreme isolation that Mary's tuberculosis progressed inexorably. Home remedies and medicinal herbs, previously at least partially effective in controlling symptoms, gradually lost their efficacy. The persistent cough transformed into hemoptysis episodes, and fever became constant. In February 1940, during a rare weather improvement allowing transit, Elizabeth sent William to town with an urgent message for Dr. Blackwood. The doctor, risking his reputation and defying the still effective family prohibition, visited the Holloway property for the first time in years. What he found was a desperate situation. Mary, now weighing less than 90 pounds, could barely rise from bed. Tuberculosis had progressed to an advanced stage, and the secondary pneumonia that had set in left little doubt about the prognosis. The doctor, aware he could do little beyond providing some comfort, supplied morphine to relieve pain and detailed instructions for Elizabeth on administering it. Before departing, Dr. Blackwood had a frank conversation with Elizabeth and George Jr., the most lucid family members. He explained the gravity of Mary's situation and discussed the limited options for the family's future after her imminent death. He suggested the possibility of the children being sent to live with distant relatives in other states where the stigma associated with the Olai family would be unknown. This suggestion was received with a mixture of fear and determination by Elizabeth. "We are a family, Doctor. We will remain together no matter what happens. I promised my mother I would care for my siblings, and I intend to keep that promise." Dr. Blackwood, recognizing the young woman's unwavering resolution and aware of the limited alternatives truly available, reluctantly accepted her decision. Before leaving, he gave her a small book on basic health care and promised to return in 2 weeks, weather permitting. That would be the last time he would see Mary alive. In the early morning of March 5, 1940, Mary Elizabeth Olai died in her bed, surrounded by her 5 surviving children. Her last words, recorded by Elizabeth in a worn notebook that served as the family diary, were directed to her children: "You are stronger together than apart. Take care of each other as I tried to care for you." Mary's funeral, like Robert's, was a small and hurried ceremony. The local pastor, pressured by the Holloway patriarch, agreed to conduct a minimal service, although he avoided any mention of the family's circumstances or cause of death. The body was buried in the family cemetery beside Robert and little Joseph. Mary's death marked the beginning of a new phase in the Olai family history. Elizabeth, now officially the family head at 16, immediately faced pressure from older relatives to marry a second cousin, perpetuating the family tradition of consanguineous marriages. The young woman, however, had witnessed firsthand the devastating consequences of these practices. In a confrontation that would become legendary in the family, Elizabeth categorically rejected the proposal, declaring, "I've seen what marriage between relatives did to my mother and siblings. This tradition ends with me." This declaration, considered heresy by family patriarchs, resulted in almost complete ostracism of Elizabeth and her siblings. The limited support they still received from the extended family was withdrawn, and malicious rumors about Elizabeth's rebellion began circulating in the community. Socially isolated and facing growing economic difficulties, the young Holloways demonstrated remarkable resilience. William, despite his limitations, worked tirelessly on the plantation, now reduced to just a few acres of cotton and a subsistence garden. Using knowledge acquired through agriculture books borrowed from Dr. Blackwood, George Jr. implemented crop rotation techniques that significantly improved land productivity. Judith, then 12, began playing her harp at events in the neighboring town church where she wasn't known, earning small amounts that contributed to the family economy. Elizabeth, in turn, developed a small sewing business, creating and repairing clothes for families in the region. Only Sarah, now 9 and still severely impaired, remained totally dependent. Elizabeth dedicated several daily hours to caring for her youngest sister, developing her own methods to stimulate the girl's limited development potential. The family's situation changed again in 1941 with the United States' entry into World War II. William, despite his cognitive limitations, was initially drafted for military service. Dr. Blackwood intervened, documenting the young man's medical conditions and ensuring his exemption. This intervention, although well-intentioned, had unexpected consequences in the small community already predisposed against the Olice. William's exemption was interpreted as a cowardly evasion of patriotic duty. Social ostracism intensified, with some local stores explicitly refusing to serve the Olice siblings. Amid these difficulties, a ray of hope emerged for George Jr. Dr. Blackwood, impressed with the teenager's intelligence and dedication, secured a place for him at a technical school in Jackson. This opportunity, financed by a scholarship for talented rural youth, represented the first real chance for a Holloway family member to escape the cycle of isolation and limitations. The decision to allow George Jr. to leave the property wasn't easy for Elizabeth. On one hand, she recognized her brother's extraordinary potential and his right to a better life. On the other, she feared the difficulties he would face in the outside world with his fragile constitution and stigmatized surname. Finally, in September 1942, George Jr. departed for Jackson, carrying few material possessions, but a wealth of hopes and dreams. Elizabeth, in a letter written to her brother that night and carefully preserved by him throughout the following decades, expressed the mixture of pride and apprehension she felt. "You carry with you not only your own hopes but those of all of us. Go with courage. Learn everything you can. And remember you'll always have a home to return to no matter what happens." The war years were particularly difficult for the remaining family. Rationing, economic hardships, and social isolation created constant challenges. However, regular correspondence with George Jr., whose letters described a world of previously unimaginable possibilities and knowledge, provided a glimpse of hope. Another blow struck the family in 1944 when Sarah, then 13, succumbed to severe pneumonia after a particularly intense series of seizures. The youngest child's death, although emotionally devastating, was received with a complex mixture of sadness and relief, a release from suffering for the girl and from the burden of constant care for her siblings. Sarah's funeral, conducted only with the presence of siblings and Dr. Blackwood, was marked by dignified simplicity. Elizabeth, refusing to accept the standardized sermon offered by the local pastor, read herself a carefully chosen biblical passage, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." The post-war period brought significant changes for the remaining Holloway family members. George Jr., who had completed with distinction his technical course in agricultural engineering, briefly returned to the family property in 1946. His visit, marked by the emotion of reunion, also brought a proposal that would permanently alter the family's course. George had accepted a position in the newly established Soil Conservation Service in Birmingham, Alabama. The opportunity, besides representing significant professional advancement, would allow him to establish a new life away from the stigma associated with the Holloway name in Mississippi. His proposal was clear: he wanted Elizabeth and Judith to move with him, definitively abandoning the property that had been simultaneously home and prison for the family. William, now 24 and deeply rooted in the property routine, categorically refused to consider moving. "This land is my life," he declared with the direct simplicity that characterized him. "I was born here and will die here." Elizabeth, at 22, faced the most difficult decision of her life. On one hand, she felt responsible for William and reluctant to abandon him. On the other, she recognized the unique opportunity the move would represent for Judith, then 18 and demonstrating musical talent that would remain buried if she continued in the isolation of Yazoo County. After weeks of deliberation and tense conversations, a compromise solution was reached. Elizabeth would remain with William on the property, while Judith would accompany George to Birmingham, where she would have the opportunity to develop her musical talent and, perhaps more importantly, to build a life away from the stigma that had pursued her throughout childhood and adolescence. The departure of Judith and George in October 1946 marked the beginning of the final dispersion of the Olay family. Elizabeth and William remained on the property, cultivating a fraction of the original lands and living a simple but dignified existence. Over the years, social isolation gradually diminished as events that had stigmatized the family receded in the community's collective memory. In Birmingham, George Jr. built a respectable career in public service, eventually marrying a colleague who, significantly, had no family relationship with him. Judith, adopting her mother's maiden name, Anderson, to avoid the stigma associated with the Olays, developed her musical career, becoming a music teacher at a preparatory school for young ladies of Birmingham's high society. Both George and Judith maintained regular contact with Elizabeth and William through letters and occasional visits. In their correspondence, carefully preserved by Elizabeth in a cedar box that had belonged to their mother, it's possible to trace the evolution of their lives and perspectives. In a particularly revealing 1952 letter, George wrote, "Sometimes I think about what might have been if our parents and grandparents had understood the risks of their consanguineous marriages. But then I remember that without those choices, none of us would exist exactly as we are. It's a paradox with which I've learned to live in peace." Judith, in her letters to Elizabeth, frequently expressed a mixture of gratitude for the opportunity of a new life and guilt for having left her siblings behind. In correspondence dated 1954, she wrote, "Each time I receive applause after a performance, I think of you who sacrificed your own opportunities so I could have mine. Your silent courage resonates louder than any music I can create." Elizabeth and William continued living on the family property until 1962 when William suddenly died of a heart attack at 40. His death, although premature, wasn't totally unexpected, considering the congenital heart anomalies Dr. Blackwood had identified in his childhood. After her brother's death, Elizabeth finally accepted the invitation so many times reiterated by George and Judith to join them in Birmingham. At 38, she sold the family property that had been the setting for so many tragedies and silent triumphs and moved to a small apartment near George's residence. In Birmingham, Elizabeth found a late but genuine peace. Working as an assistant librarian at an elementary school, she developed an appreciation for literature that had been only vaguely cultivated during her years of isolation. On weekends, she attended Judith's performances at the local conservatory, proud of her younger sister's talent that had flourished despite all adversities. George Jr., in his career at the Soil Conservation Service, became a passionate advocate for rural education and healthcare access for isolated communities. Without ever fully revealing his personal history, he used his experience as motivation to implement programs aimed at breaking the cultural and informational isolation of Alabama's rural communities. Elizabeth was diagnosed with breast cancer in 1968. The disease, detected at an advanced stage, reflected years of neglect with her own health while dedicated to caring for others. The treatment, painful and debilitating, was endured with the same silent dignity that had characterized her entire life. During her treatment period, Elizabeth began systematically documenting the Olay family history in one notebook after another filled with her meticulous handwriting. She recorded not only the tragic events that had marked the family but also moments of connection, love, and resilience that had allowed their survival. This autobiographical project, initially conceived as a private record, gained an unexpected dimension when George, recognizing its potential value as a historical and educational document, suggested it be shared with medical and social researchers. In 1970, Elizabeth's manuscripts were incorporated into a pioneering study on the effects of consanguinity in isolated rural populations conducted by the University of Alabama. The study, initially published in academic journals and subsequently adapted for a book aimed at the general public, used the Holloway history, with names changed to protect survivors' privacy, as a central case study. Elizabeth didn't live to see the full impact of her testimony. She died in September 1971 at 47 after a cancer recurrence. Her funeral, held in Birmingham with the presence of George, Judith, and a small circle of friends and colleagues, dramatically contrasted with the hurried and almost clandestine burials that had marked the family in the past. George and Judith continued honoring their older sister's legacy in their own way. George through his work in public policies aimed at rural communities, Judith by establishing a small scholarship in Elizabeth's name for young musicians from disadvantaged communities. When Dr. James Blackwood died at 94 in 1985, his personal diaries containing detailed observations about the Holloway family were donated, according to his will, to the University of Mississippi Medical School. These documents, combined with Elizabeth's manuscripts, provided an extraordinarily complete view of consanguinity's effects in a specific family over several generations. The resulting study, published in 1987 under the title Isolation and Inheritance, a longitudinal study of consanguinity effects, became a reference text in medical genetics and ethics courses. The Holloway case, presented with scientific rigor but without sensationalism, served as a powerful argument for genetic education and healthcare access in isolated communities. George Jr. died in 1992 at 66, leaving a legacy of public service that had indirectly touched thousands of lives in Alabama's rural communities. Judith, the last survivor of Mary and Robert's 6 children, lived until 2005, dying at 77 after a life dedicated to music and teaching. The original Holloway property in Yazoo County was eventually incorporated into a larger farm, and over the decades, physical traces of the family's presence gradually disappeared. The small family cemetery, however, was preserved as part of an agreement in the property sale. In 2010, a simple plaque was installed in the cemetery through the initiative of a group of medical students at the University of Mississippi inspired by the Holloway case study in their medical ethics course. The inscription, deliberately vague to protect family privacy but deeply meaningful for those familiar with their history, simply says, "In memory of those whose lives and sufferings illuminated the path to understanding and compassion." Today, the story of Mary Olai and her 6 children with cousin Robert remains a powerful testimony to the consequences of scientific ignorance, cultural isolation, and the dangers of consanguinity. But it's also a narrative of extraordinary resilience, unwavering family love in the face of extreme adversity, and the human capacity to transcend the most limiting circumstances. As Elizabeth wrote in the final pages of her manuscript, "We were born from our ancestors' mistakes. We carry the marks of these errors in our bodies and minds, but we are not defined solely by our inheritance. In the choices we make, in the lives we build despite everything, lies our true humanity." Make sure you're already subscribed to this channel. Historical treasures that reveal painful truths about our collective past are stories like Mary Holloway's. Subscribe now to continue exploring the hidden chapters of American history that have silently shaped our society. If you watched until here, it's because you enjoyed this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here," so I can get to know you and learn who really enjoys the stories on this channel. Don't forget to like and share this story with someone who values knowing the hidden truths of our history. Each like and share helps preserve these memories for future generations.